The universe has known war longer than it has known peace. For 1,000 years, the galaxy has trembled under the relentless grind of the eternal conflict, a war so ancient, so consuming, that entire civilizations have risen and fallen in its shadow. On one side, the Xarathi, a hive-minded swarm of insectoid warriors, relentless in their expansion. On the other, the Vossk, crystalline beings of razor-sharp intellect, their empire carved from the bones of 100 conquered worlds. Neither side remembers how it began, neither side believes it can end, until one day a single human steps into the crossfire, armed with nothing but his voice and the audacity to believe he can stop it. This is the story of Elias Vance, a diplomat with no army, no fleet, no weapons, only words, and those words would crack the foundation of a war older than human civilization itself. Imagine standing in the heart of a star system torn apart by generations of hatred, where every planet bears the scars of orbital bombardments, where children are born knowing nothing but the drums of war. Now imagine walking into that storm, not with a gun but with an outstretched hand. That's what Elias did, and what happened next defied every law of politics, every expectation of history. This isn't just a tale of negotiation. It's a story about the power of an idea, the idea that even in the darkest corners of the cosmos, understanding can be stronger than violence. It's about the moment a single voice, speaking the right words at the right time, can shatter the unshakable. And it's about the terrifying, exhilarating truth that sometimes the most fragile thing in the universe, a human being, can bend the course of empires. So how did he do it? How did a lone diplomat from a species barely known in the galactic community silence the guns of a 1,000-year war? The answer lies in the most dangerous weapon of all, the truth. And the truth is, this story is just beginning. The air on Nexus 9 hummed with the tension of 1,000 unsheathed blades. The station's neutral halls, carved from cold alloy and flickering holograms, had never felt so fragile. On one side of the table, the Xarathi general loomed, its chitinous limbs twitching with barely restrained violence, pheromones of aggression thick enough to taste. On the other, the Vossk commander sat motionless, its crystalline body refracting the dim light into jagged patterns, each facet a silent threat. Between them, the scars of war weren't just metaphorical. Fresh plasma burns streaked the Xarathi's carapace, while the Vosk's once pristine surface bore the cracks of recent artillery fire. Neither side had come to talk, they'd come to dominate. And then there was Elias, no armor, no retinue, just a man in a simple envoy's coat, his hands resting palms up on the table, a gesture so disarmingly human it bordered on absurdity in that room. When the Xarathi general snarled, "We do not speak with prey," its voice a chorus of clicking mandibles, Elias didn't flinch. When the Vossk commander dismissed humanity as irrelevant, its words like shattering ice, Elias actually smiled. Not a politician's grin, not a diplomat's mask, the smile of someone who'd walked into the furnace and found the one spot the flames couldn't reach. Then let's make humanity relevant. Silence, not the quiet of contemplation, but the stunned hush of a detonation's aftermath. The Xarathi's antennae stiffened. The Vosk's core flickered, its crystalline lattice vibrating at a frequency just shy of ultrasonic. For the first time in centuries, the two factions weren't glaring at each other, they were staring at the anomaly between them. A creature too soft to survive a single skirmish, speaking as if it held the leverage of a fleet. What they didn't know, what they couldn't fathom, was that Elias hadn't come to negotiate terms. He'd come to expose the lie at the heart of their war. And the lie was this: after 1,000 years, they'd forgotten how to want anything but victory. But desire could be reshaped, and that was the crack Elias would widen until the entire edifice of their hatred crumbled. The room held its breath. The first move had been made. The impossible had begun. The air turned to static when the shot rang out. a Xarathi extremist, all chitin and fury, had slipped through security, its plasma pistol aimed straight at Elias's heart. But the blast didn't find him. It tore through his aide, a young woman named Lara who'd once joked she'd rather be studying xenobotany than babysitting diplomats. Her body hit the floor before anyone could react. The room erupted. Xarathi guards raised their claws in defense. Vossk soldiers leveled crystalline rifles, and for one terrible second, the fragile truce teetered on the edge of annihilation. Then Elias moved, not toward cover, not toward retaliation. He knelt beside the assassin's corpse, a Xarathi grunt, barely more than a hatchling by their standards, its carapace still streaked with the colors of a low-caste worker. The room froze as his fingers brushed the torn edge of the creature's battle harness, where a small, frayed pictograph dangled, a family sigil perhaps, or a brood marker. No one had ever looked at a dead Xarathi soldier like that before, like it was more than an enemy, like it had been someone. This, Elias said, his voice raw, is what war gives us. Wasted lives, the words hung there, heavier than plasma fire. The Xarathi general recoiled, its antennae flicking in confusion. This wasn't the script. The human should have screamed for vengeance, demanded blood payment, turned this into another excuse for the guns to speak. Instead, he grieved for both corpses. Then something even more impossible happened. The Vossk commander raised a jagged limb, not to attack but to signal its guards, weapons lowered, not all of them, not right away, but enough. Its crystalline form pulsed with something like curiosity, refracting Elias's image in a dozen fractured angles. "You mourn the killer?" it asked, the words brittle with disbelief. Elias didn't look up. "I mourn the fact that this soldier thought murder was the only language left to speak." Silence, not the quiet of tension this time, but the stillness of something breaking. A crack in the story. Both sides had told themselves for centuries that the other was incapable of grief, of nuance, of being anything but a target. The Xarathi general's aggression pheromones faltered. The Vossk commander's core flickered, its light dimmed by something unreadable, and in that moment the unthinkable became possible. Doubt, not peace, not yet, but the seed of it, planted in the rubble of a single, shattered expectation. Because Elias hadn't just refused revenge, he'd shown them the cost, and for the first time in 1,000 years, both sides saw it. The archives beneath the Xarathi throne world weren't just hidden, they were erased. Scorched terminals, fractured data crystals, entire corridors of memory purged by fire. But Elias had spent months chasing whispers, bribing low-caste workers with stories of their own lost broods until he found it. A single intact vault buried beneath 12 generations of propaganda, and there, glowing in the sickly light of a dying power core, was the truth, not a declaration of war. Not some grand insult between empires, a single mistranslated word. The recording shimmered, an ancient Vossk transmission intercepted by Xarathi scouts in the early days. The Vossk envoy had spoken of preservation, their crystalline language rich with layered meaning, but the Xarathi translation matrix, built for blunt wartime commands, spat out consumption. To a hive that valued nothing more than territory, it sounded like a threat to devour their worlds. Within hours, the first brood ships launched. Within days, the first Vossk colonies burned. 1,000 years of slaughter born from a single error. Elias didn't run to the diplomats, didn't call for a grand assembly. He walked straight into the chamber of the Xarathi High Queen, her segmented body coiled atop a dais of fused enemy skulls. When she hissed, "You dare," he activated the recording. The ancient voices filled the chamber. Vossk harmonics, Xarathi translation errors, the fatal gap between them. And then Elias spoke 3 words that struck harder than any fleet. "You've been dying." A pause, just long enough for the Queen's antennae to stiffen. For a lie, the chamber erupted. Warriors clattered their claws, brood mothers keened in dissonant fury. But the Queen went still, not the stillness of rage. The terrible quiet of a mind unraveling. When she finally spoke, her voice dripped with something worse than anger, contempt. Truth changes nothing. The war is who we are now. Elias expected denial, even hoped for it. Denial can be cracked, but this was worse. The Queen wasn't rejecting the truth, she was acknowledging it. And spitting on its relevance, because after centuries the lie didn't matter anymore. The war had become its own reason, its own god, and that's when Elias realized he wasn't fighting history. He was fighting addiction, so he gambled, not on reason, not on justice, on the one thing even addicts fear more than withdrawal: emptiness. "Then tell me, Your Majesty," he murmured, "who were you before the war?" The question hung like a blade over the hive, because the terrifying answer was nothing. The Xarathi had no art, no music, no stories that didn't end in battle. Their children memorized tactics before they could speak. Their greatest poets wrote victory chants. Without war, they weren't just weak, they were nothing. And Elias had just forced their queen to stare into that void. Her mandibles flexed, a tremor ran through her carapace. Not rage now, something raw and primal. The fear of a species realizing for the first time that they'd forgotten how to be alive. The silence stretched until it ached, until even the warriors lowered their claws. Until the truth wasn't just known, it was felt, and in that moment Elias saw it: the first fracture in the empire of war, not a crack in their resolve. A crack in their identity. Now came the dangerous part, because when addicts face withdrawal, they either collapse or lash out, and the Queen's next words would decide which way a 1,000-year-old empire would fall. The transmission erupted across 100 star systems like a supernova of truth. Elias didn't just leak the archives, he weaponized them. Every terminal, every public screen, every warship's console suddenly blared the ancient mistranslation alongside footage of the Queen's silence, spliced with battlefield carnage spanning centuries. The effect was instantaneous. Xarathi workers paused mid-labors, their mandibles slack. Vossk artisans froze mid-sculpture, their crystalline hands trembling. For the first time in living memory, the roar of war machines faltered, replaced by a far more dangerous sound: questions. Riots tore through the Xarathi brood complexes, not of rage but revelation. Low-caste nurturers hurled nutrient vats at their overseers, screaming, "My larvae deserve more than battle chants." On the crystalline spires of Vossk Prime, scholars shattered their data shards in protest, their harmonics wailing, "We traded music for murder." The war's foundation wasn't just cracking, it was dissolving in real time, dissolving in the acid of a truth too obvious to ignore. They'd been killing each other for a clerical error. That's when the message came, encrypted, untraceable, a Vossk scholar's voice whispering through Elias's calm like frost on glass. "You've cracked the foundation. Now watch it crumble." The words should have thrilled him. Instead, they coiled in his gut like ice, because Elias understood now he hadn't just exposed a lie. He'd exposed the war's architects, the generals, the armament guilds, the entire parasitic ecosystem that fed on eternal conflict, and those creatures never surrendered. They adapted. The first assassination attempt came disguised as a peace offering, a Xarathi courier bearing a truce gift that leaked neurotoxin when opened. The second was subtler, a Vossk data drive that tried to rewrite his ship's life support into a vacuum chamber. Each failure made the attacks more brazen, more desperate. Because Elias had done the unthinkable, he'd given both empires a common enemy. Not each other, the truth, and in the shadows something worse stirred. The Queen's silence wasn't contemplation, it was calculation. The Vossk High Council's investigation into the archives wasn't accountability, it was cover. Because when addicts can't ignore withdrawal, they'll obliterate whoever forced them to face it. Elias had gambled on revelation, breaking the cycle. But in the darkness between stars, the war's architects were placing a far darker bet, that it's easier to kill one man than change 1,000 years of habit. The scholar's warning echoed as Elias stared at the latest casualty report, not from the front lines but from the riots, workers crushed by enforcers. Protesters flash frozen in Vossk suppression fields. The truth was out, and now it was drowning in blood, not the clean death of battle, the messy, screaming death of awakening. Because the terrible secret no one admits about ending a war is this: sometimes the addicted would rather burn the world than face sobriety. Elias's hand hovered over the broadcast console one more time. Not with evidence now, with a choice, the same choice he'd given the Queen, the same choice echoing in every ravaged heart across the galaxy. Who were you before the war? And the far harder question, who will you be after? The console gleamed, the galaxy held its breath, and in that moment Elias understood the truth hadn't ended the war. It had only given it a new battlefield, and the casualty list was growing by the second. The sky over Nexus 9 split open like a wound as the Xarathi flagship descended. A monstrous obsidian claw wreathed in the ionized glow of 1,000 battles. Its shadow alone crushed the station's deflectors, buckling docking pylons under the weight of its fury. The Queen's voice crackled through every comm channel, not as a transmission but a verdict: yield the human or burn with him. And then, impossibly, the Vossk commander stepped forward, not toward Elias, between him and the viewscreen. Its crystalline body caught the emergency lights, scattering them like shards of defiance. No more pawns, it hissed, the harmonics of its voice vibrating with something deeper than strategy. Rage, not at Elias, not even at the Xarathi, at the grotesque familiarity of the moment. Another sacrifice, another demand, another lie wrapped in the stench of necessity. Elias didn't waste the gift. He lunged for the comm panel, his fingers dancing across controls never meant for human hands. "Your Majesty," he called, his voice stripped raw. "You want me? Then look at me." The screens flickered to life, magnifying his face across every deck of her warship, not as a prisoner, not as prey, but as a mirror. Not through envoys, not through threats, you and me, right now. Silence, the kind that comes when tectonic plates hesitate before the quake. Even the station's groaning metal seemed to still. Then a chuckle, low, guttural, vibrating through the comms like a blade dragged across bone. The Queen's face filled the screen, her compound eyes reflecting Elias's image back at him 1,000 times over. "You think bravery impresses me, soft thing. I've scoured worlds of your kind." Her mandibles flexed, dripping with contempt. "Speak, but know this: your words die with you." Elias exhaled, not in fear, in relief, because the trap wasn't his, it was hers. She'd just handed him the one thing no warlord ever expects to lose: an audience. "Tell me, Your Majesty," he began, his voice softer now, intimate as a scalpel. "What will you tell your brood mothers when they ask why Nexus 9 burns? Will you say it was for honor, or will you admit it's because one human made you afraid?" A hiss, not from the Queen, from her attendants, a ripple of shock through the chamber. No one spoke to the High Queen like that, no one lived to. Elias leaned closer, his shadow merging with hers on the screen. "You could kill me, you could glass this station. But we both know what really dies today." A pause, just long enough for the unspoken truth to coil around her thorax, the lie that this war ever needed a reason. The Vossk commander's facets blazed sudden crimson, not aggression, alarm. It understood now. Elias wasn't negotiating, he was detonating the last bridge behind them. No more intermediaries, no more proxies, just a Queen and the truth, circling each other in the raw, airless dark where empires crumble. And in that moment, the unthinkable teetered on the edge of possibility. Not peace, not yet, but something far more dangerous, a war with no one left to blame. The air in the throne room tasted like rust and aggression pheromones thick enough to choke on. Xarathi guards formed a living wall of chitin and curved blades, their compound eyes reflecting Elias's hunched form as he knelt before the High Queen's dais. Her shadow alone could have crushed him, a mountain of obsidian carapace. each segment carved with the sigils of conquered systems. When she leaned down, her claws scraped against his jugular, their razor tips drawing twin beads of blood. The advisors held their breath, the guards tightened their grips. This was how rebellions ended in the swarm, with a single wet snap. Elias tilted his head back. Not in defiance, not in surrender, like a scholar examining an interesting specimen. "Go ahead," he murmured, his voice barely louder than the ship's ambient hum. "But know this, my death won't silence the truth. It'll etch it into history." The Queen's claws twitched, not striking, hesitating, because Elias wasn't threatening. He was offering her a calculus no warlord ever wants to face, the cost of martyrdom. A ripple passed through the attendants. A brood mother's antennae flicked toward the data pylon, still displaying the ancient mistranslation. A tactician's mandibles ground in silent agitation. Tiny movements, unthinkable ones. For the first time in 7 generations, the swarm's harmony fractured into whispers. The Queen's voice came as a vibration through the deck plates, low enough to tremble in Elias's ribs. "You think truth matters to us? We are the swarm. We devour stars." Elias smiled, not the polished grin of a diplomat, the raw, exhausted smile of a man who'd already lost too much to fear the last gamble. "Then why does it hurt you?" His fingers brushed the blood on his neck, holding the crimson smear up to the light. "Why kill a liar if the lie never mattered?" Silence, not the quiet of obedience, the deafening void of a paradigm cracking. The Queen's claws hovered, trembling with something worse than rage, uncertainty. Behind her, a young nurturer dared to reach for her brood sibling's claw. An elder tactician's pheromones bled confusion into the air, and in that moment Elias saw the fulcrum of history tremble. Because empires don't fall to armies, they collapse when the whisper spreads, the whisper that says, "We don't have to." And the Queen knew it. Her claws didn't retract. But they didn't slash either, frozen in the space between instinct and revelation, between the past and the terrible, terrifying possibility of a future unwritten. The throne room held its breath, the war held its breath, and in that suspended moment the unthinkable became tangible: choice. The hologram flickered to life with a sound like breaking glass, and suddenly the Vossk commander's crystalline form dominated the throne room, its facets reflecting the Queen's own rage back at her in jagged fragments. A single heartbeat of stillness from your ship, it intoned, the harmonics of its voice vibrating through the deck. "And our orbital lances reduce your homeworld to molten slag." The threat hung there, precise as a scalpel, cold, clinical, the inevitable conclusion of 1,000 years of mutually assured destruction. The guards bristled. The Queen's claws twitched, and Elias laughed, not a diplomatic chuckle, not a nervous tick, a raw, ugly sound ripped from somewhere deeper than protocol, louder than fear. Of course, he spat, wiping blood from his neck with a shaking hand. "The second one of you hesitates, the other strikes. You're both still playing the same game." The words weren't just an accusation. They were a dissection laying bare the rotten core of the war's longevity. Not strategy, not even hatred. A feedback loop of paranoia so entrenched it had become instinct. The hologram's light pulsed erratically. The Queen's antennae flattened against her skull. For a heartbeat, the room teetered on the edge of violence, until Elias stepped between them, his outstretched hands not pleading but framing them like specimens under glass. "Look at yourselves," he hissed, "a queen who rules through fear, a commander who thinks genocide is a bargaining chip. You've spent centuries calling each other monsters, and you're right." A pause, just long enough for the insult to sear, but not for the reasons you think. Silence, the kind that comes when two predators realize they've been circling the same drain. The Vossk commander's facets dimmed, its refraction patterns slowing, calculating. The Queen's claws retracted slightly, not in retreat but revelation. Because Elias hadn't just called them monsters, he'd revealed the cage they'd built for themselves, the unspoken pact that kept the war alive. The moment one side showed mercy, the other would pounce. The moment one disarmed, the other would strike. A game so rigged, the only way to win was to keep playing. And in that moment, the fragile truth Elias had been hammering into the galaxy's spine finally snapped taut. They weren't trapped by the war. They were trapped by the rules of it. The control panel sparked under Elias's fingers as he rerouted power from life support to the ship's holographic arrays, a gamble that could suffocate them all in minutes. Alarms shrieked through the throne room, bathing the Queen's carapace in emergency red as the main display flickered, then split. On the left, the original Vossk transmission, their harmonics singing of preservation like ice crystals forming in silence. On the right, the Xarathi translation, its jagged glyphs screaming consumption. Between them, scrolling in real time, the casualty counters from both empires, numbers so vast they blurred into obscenity. Elias didn't shout, he didn't need to, his voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel. Look at what your pride has cost. The Queen's claws lashed out not at Elias but at the screen, as if she could claw the truth back into the void. The Vossk commander's hologram pulsed erratically, its facets distorting under the weight of the evidence, but neither spoke, neither could, because the numbers weren't just statistics. They were names, worlds, generations reduced to footnotes in a war built on a single misread word, and then movement. A Xarathi broodmother stepped forward, her carapace still streaked with the residue of nutrient vats from the lower decks. Her voice, when it came, wasn't the click-rattle of military cadence. It wavered. My third clutch. They were seated on the front lines for this. The Vossk commander's harmonics fractured into dissonance. Our archives held the truth. We knew. We never corrected it. Silence thicker than vacuum settled over the room. Not the silence of shock, the silence of shame, because Elias hadn't just shown them the lie. He'd forced them to stand knee-deep in its consequences, to see the mountains of corpses not as sacrifices but as receipts. The Queen's mandibles quivered, her aggression pheromones thinning into something unfamiliar. The Vossk commander's light dimmed, its refraction pattern slowing like a clockwork mechanism winding down. And in that terrible stillness, the war didn't end, but something far more fragile began, the first tremor of accountability. The sound of a plasma rifle clattering to the deck plates was sharper than any war cry. Every compound eye in the throne room snapped toward the source. A Xarathi frontline soldier, her carapace pitted with shrapnel scars, her left antennae severed at the base. She didn't kneel, didn't beg, just stood there, her empty claws raised in a gesture so alien to the swarm it took the Queen a full second to recognize it. Surrender. 3 broods, the soldier hissed, her vocal sac vibrating with grief thicker than pheromones. 3 clutches of eggs fed to the crushers for this war. No more. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then a Vossk artillery officer's crystalline form flickered as it deactivated its targeting matrix. A Xarathi broodmother crumpled a tactical scroll in her claws. Tiny acts, revolutionary ones, because in an empire built on absolute obedience, the first crack isn't the loudest. It's the one that makes every other fracture inevitable. The Queen's chitinous plates flared, her aggression pheromones flooding the chamber in a last, desperate surge. You betray the swarm. Her voice wasn't rage now. It was the sound of a dam splintering. The soldier didn't cower. She tilted her scarred head toward the still glowing casualty counters, their numbers stitching across the screen like a hemorrhage. No, Majesty, we're betraying the lie that kept us starving. And then it happened, the thing no algorithm could have predicted, no tactician could have weaponized. A low-caste nurturer began to hum, not a war chant, a brood song. The kind sung over hatchlings in their nutrient vats, the kind outlawed after the 3rd century of mobilization. The sound was ragged, off-key, and it spread like fire through dry tinder. Xarathi medics laid down their bone saws, Vossk engineers powered down their siege engines. Not in unison, not as a coordinated revolt, as something far more dangerous, individuals one by one, remembering they had choices. The Queen's claws spasmed, her once impervious carapace suddenly porous under the weight of their collective gaze. She wasn't facing mutiny, she was facing something infinitely more terrifying: irrelevance. Because when the myth of inevitability shatters, the people holding the pieces get to decide what comes next. And in that moment, the throne room wasn't just a chamber, it was a chasm, and on the other side, glimmering faintly through the smoke and the static, waited the most dangerous possibility of all: peace. The High Queen's shriek cut through the throne room like a particle beam through flesh, a sound that had once sent entire battle divisions to their knees. But this time the guards didn't move, their claws stayed lowered, their antennae didn't twitch toward weapons, just a silent, seething line of carapace and defiance between their monarch and the truth. Elias didn't smile, didn't gloat. He stepped forward, the deck plates vibrating beneath him as the ship's ancient infrastructure groaned under the weight of the moment. His voice, when it came, wasn't triumphant, it was tired, worn raw by the cost of this revelation. You still have a choice, a beat. The Queen's mandibles spasmed. Die a tyrant or live as the Queen who chose peace. That's when the ship's AI blared to life, its synthetic voice slicing through the tension. Alert. Vossk Armada exiting slipspace at 0.50, configuration defensive formation. The holograms flickered, displaying 100 crystalline warships, not with weapons charged, but with their iconic refraction sails deployed in the ancient symbol of ceasefire. The Vossk commander's projection pulsed once sharply, its harmonics vibrating with something that wasn't quite an apology. Our fleets stand down. Our guns go cold. The choice was never just yours, High Queen. For 3 heartbeats, the universe held its breath. The Queen's claws flexed, her compound eyes reflecting the ceasefire sigils back at herself in countless fractured images. The brood mother's hum faltered. The wounded soldier's posture sagged. Even Elias froze, because this wasn't just surrender. This was the one scenario no war simulation had ever accounted for: mutual disarmament. Then the Queen did the unthinkable. She laughed, a wet, jagged sound like a hull breach cracking open, her chitinous body shuddering with the force of it. All these centuries, she hissed, her pheromones reeking of something dangerously close to hysteria. And peace only comes when both sides are too exhausted to lie to themselves anymore. Her claws didn't rise in command, they didn't lash out in fury, they simply uncurled, the way a corpse relaxes into rigor mortis. Outside the viewports, the Vossk Armada's sails shimmered like a galaxy of suspended ice crystals. Inside, the first Xarathi engineer reached for the weapons console, not to fire, but to initiate the long-dormant disarmament protocols. The system asked for confirmation. Across the room, the Queen's voice rasped a single word, not a decree, not an order, just the exhausted sigh of someone finally stepping out from under the weight of 1,000 years of ghosts. Yes, the ceasefire lasted exactly 17 minutes. That's how long it took for the first plasma grenade to detonate near the negotiation chamber's eastern bulkhead, not from outside but from within. The blast tore through a column of Vossk diplomats, their crystalline bodies shattering like glass under the concussive force. Chaos erupted in a single, shuddering heartbeat. Xarathi royal guards wheeled on their own brood siblings, claws unsheathing with wet snicks as the coup faction's pheromone stench flooded the vents. Across the room, Vossk hardliners triggered their refraction bombs, turning their own bodies into shrapnel. The air became a storm of chitin and prismatic shards. Elias barely registered the hands yanking him backward, a Xarathi defector in a tattered scout's harness, its carapace streaked with the neural burns of a recent hive link severance. "Move, soft thing," it rasped, dragging him through a service duct as the ceiling rained molten alloy. The station's alarm klaxons wailed like a dying beast, but beneath them, Elias heard something worse, the guttural chant of Xarathi traditionalists, their mandibles clicking in time with the war drums now thundering through every comm channel. The Vossk weren't silent either, their harmonics twisted into something jagged and dissonant, the battle hymns of an empire refusing to kneel. The defector's grip tightened as another explosion rocked the duct, its compound eyes reflecting the firelight in fractured bursts. "You miscalculated, human," it hissed, its voice thick with something almost like pity. "You thought shame would stop them, but shame only works on those who still believe in redemption." A fresh detonation sent tremors through the walls, the shockwave so close it rattled Elias's teeth. Somewhere above them, the station's main reactor began its emergency venting sequence, a last-ditch effort to prevent total meltdown. The defector's antennae twitched toward the sound, then flattened against its skull. They'd rather burn the galaxy than admit they were wrong. Elias didn't answer. Couldn't, because the truth was worse than the defector knew. This wasn't just about pride or dogma. It was about identity, the terror of waking up one day and realizing the story you'd built your life on was a lie. And when cornered, creatures always fought hardest to protect the lies they loved most. The duct opened into a ruined hangar bay, half its docking clamps sheared off by artillery fire. The defector shoved Elias toward a battered escape pod, its hatch already cycling open. "Go, now, before they..." The rest of the sentence dissolved into static as a Vossk heavy cruiser's silhouette eclipsed the bay's shattered viewport, its lance batteries humming to life. Not aiming outward, inward, at the station itself, Elias lunged for the pod, but his fingers barely grazed the hatch seal before the world turned white. The last thing he heard wasn't the explosion. It was the defector's final, furious click moan, a Xarathi death rattle, equal parts grief and defiance as the shockwave took them both. The Vossk commander's body didn't collapse so much as unravel, crystalline facets fracturing in slow motion, each shard catching the emergency lights as it fell, scattering prismatic echoes across the blood-slick deck. Elias barely registered the weight of the command chip pressed into his palm, still warm from the dying being's grip. Make it mean something. The words weren't a plea. They were a detonation charge wired to the last intact pillar of Elias's resolve. Around them, the station groaned like a living thing in its death throes. Radical Vossk zealots had breached the inner sanctum, their war hymns vibrating through the bulkheads. Xarathi traditionalists answered with guttural click roars, their pheromone trails so thick they hung like fog in the air. And between them all Elias, kneeling in the wreckage of ceasefires and good intentions, fingers curled around the one thing that could stop the coming firestorm. If he dared use it, the chip's encryption pulsed against his skin, its biometric lock already disengaged by the commander's final act. With this, Elias could access the Vossk Armada's deadliest protocols. Not just their weapons, their history, every classified atrocity, every falsified battle report, the proof, raw and unedited, that their so-called holy war had been built on the same rot as the Xarathis. A plasma round seared past his ear, close enough to scorch his cheek. The radicals were getting closer. He could hear the Xarathi brood mothers screaming orders to purge the weakness from their ranks. The irony was almost beautiful. Both factions, so desperate to annihilate the other, were now mirror images of chaos, and Elias, he was the only one who'd seen the original reflection. The chip slid into his comm unit with a whisper. Screens flared to life around him, not with tactical readouts but with faces. Vossk children in creche spires, their crystalline forms still soft at the edges. Xarathi hatchlings in nutrient vats, their tiny mandibles gnawing at the shadows of a war they'd inherit. The commander hadn't given him a weapon, he'd given him a witness. Another explosion rocked the deck, closer this time. Elias didn't flinch. His fingers danced across the console, not inputting codes, broadcasting them. Every ship, every terminal, every last backwater outpost still clinging to the lie that this war had ever been about anything but fear. Let them see what their leaders had hidden. Let them see the cost, and when the first Vossk radical lunged from the smoke, his refraction blade singing through the air, Elias didn't raise his hands in defense. He turned his wrist, showing the dying commander's final gift flickering on his screen, the face of the radical's own brood sibling, liquefied in an unnecessary orbital strike 3 cycles prior. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked, soft as a scalpel. The blade froze mid-arc, not out of mercy, out of something far more dangerous, recognition, because the cruelest truth of war isn't that it turns people into monsters. It's that it convinces them they have no choice, and in that suspended second, with the station collapsing around them and the galaxy holding its breath, Elias did the one thing no algorithm could have predicted. He reached for the radical's weapon, not to take it, but to lower it. "You still have a choice," he said, echoing the words he'd once wasted on queens and commanders. But this time he wasn't speaking to power, he was speaking to the powerless. And for the first time in 1,000 years, someone listened. The comms array sparked under Elias's fingers, its ancient circuits protesting as he rerouted every scrap of power to the broadcast feed. No encryption, no filters, just raw signal bleeding into every frequency from the battle-scarred orbital relays to the civilian receivers on 100 occupied worlds. The screen flickered to life, framing his face, not the polished image of a diplomat, but a man hollowed out by grief and stubbornness, his cheek still smeared with Vossk blood from the hangar bay. "You've been told the other side is monstrous." His voice cracked on the last word, not from weakness, but from the weight of what came next. "Look at me. I'm just a human, no claws, no crystalline armor, just flesh that bleeds and a heart that breaks, and if I can believe in peace after everything I've seen." A pause, just long enough for the image to stutter across 1,000 screens, Xarathi workers pausing mid-shift, Vossk scholars freezing mid-debate, front-line soldiers hesitating with fingers on triggers. "Why can't you?" The transmission didn't end with a plea or a promise. It ended with static, the kind left by a man stepping away from the mic while the universe held its breath. Then the dam broke. A Xarathi dreadnought near the Kronos belt powered down its primary weapons array, its crew broadcasting their brood mothers' lullabies across open channels. On the crystalline spires of Vossk Prime, 3 high-ranking tacticians shattered their command shards in unison, their harmonics vibrating with a single, unmistakable note: enough. The mutiny didn't spread like wildfire. It erupted, a chain reaction of defiance igniting in engine rooms and barracks and launch bays where no one had dared whisper dissent for centuries. A Vossk artillery officer, her facets still cracked from suppressing riots hours earlier, turned her targeting matrix not toward enemy ships but toward the derelict monuments of forgotten battles. "We erase the past ourselves," she hummed to her squad, and the first orbital lance struck the ruins of a Xarathi brood temple, not in hatred but in catharsis. Meanwhile, deep in the irradiated trenches of a contested moon, a Xarathi hatchling barely old enough to wield a pulse rifle did the unthinkable. She aimed at the sky and lowered her weapon, not because she was ordered to, because for the first time in her short, brutal life, no one was telling her what to do. The war didn't end that day. But something more important happened. The myth of its inevitability shattered like glass under a boot, and in those jagged edges, reflected in a million eyes across the galaxy, flickered the most dangerous question of all: what if we just stop? The chains around the High Queen's chitinous limbs clanked as the guards forced her to her knees before Elias, her once gleaming carapace now dull with scorch marks and the grime of defeat. The room buzzed with tension, Xarathi defectors and Vossk survivors alike crowding the shattered observation deck, their eyes burning with expectation. They wanted spectacle, they wanted retribution, but Elias reached for the neural key at his belt and did the unthinkable. He unlocked her restraints. The shock in the room was a living thing. A Vossk elder hissed, their crystalline facets flashing crimson. A Xarathi brood mother's claws twitched toward her sidearm, but Elias didn't flinch. He tossed the key onto the deck between them, the metallic clatter echoing like a gunshot in the silence. "Punishing you won't undo the past," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Help me fix the future." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the Queen's antennae, once held high with imperial arrogance, quivered. her mandibles parted, not in a snarl but in something closer to disbelief. "You would spare me." The words weren't a challenge, they were a confession. She'd spent centuries believing mercy was weakness, compassion a flaw to be purged. Now, faced with it, she had no script. Elias crouched to her level, close enough that she could see the dark circles under his eyes, the fresh scars from the station's collapse. "I don't need your surrender," he murmured. "I need your voice. The swarm still listens to you. Tell them the war's over, not because we won, but because we chose to." And then, slowly, painfully, like a limb waking from numbness, the High Queen bowed her head. Not the shallow dip of strategy, not the calculated tilt of a prisoner biding time. The full, shuddering bow of something breaking inside her. When she spoke again, her voice wasn't the razor-edged command of a monarch. It was the raw, fractured rasp of a being who just glimpsed the cost of 1,000 years of pride. What if they refuse? Elias didn't offer reassurance. He didn't promise victory. He simply opened his palm, not in demand but in offer. "Then we'll have tried." And that's more than anyone's done in a millennium. Outside, the guns were still warm, the grudges still smoldered, but in that moment the future didn't hinge on weapons or treaties. It hinged on a single, impossible question. What happens when the architects of war finally run out of excuses to keep fighting? The chamber smelled of charred alloy and antiseptic, the air thick with the pheromones of nervous Xarathi and the subtle crystalline resonance of uneasy Vossk. Elias stood between them on the makeshift dais, just a man in a stained envoy's coat, his hands empty, his voice raw from days of shouting over the din of collapsing empires. To his left, the High Queen's carapace bore fresh gouges where her own honor guard had tried to execute her before the defectors intervened. To his right, the last surviving Vossk elder pulsed faintly, its prismatic facets dimmed by exhaustion and grief. And below them, crammed into what had once been a warship's munitions hold, the crowd waited. Not soldiers, not diplomats, the ones who'd somehow survived the war's final, convulsive spasms, the mechanics and medics, the nurturers and engineers, their faces reflecting 1,000 years of inherited fury and something else. Something fragile. The Queen's first step forward echoed like a meteor strike. Her claws, once weapons that had carved through battle lines, now trembled against the lectern. When she spoke, her voice wasn't the imperial snarl that had commanded fleets. It cracked. "We were wrong." Silence, not the stunned silence of shock, but the breathless hush of a universe recalibrating. In the front row, a Xarathi medic dropped her cauterizer. The tool clattered against the deck, the sound impossibly loud. Then, movement. The Vossk elder glided forward, its fractured body scattering light across the Queen's scarred chiton. So were we. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't weep, they vibrated. A low, wordless hum building from Xarathi thoraxes and Vossk cores alike, harmonizing in a way their species biologists would have sworn was impossible. Elias closed his eyes just for a second, letting the sound wash over him. This wasn't victory. Victory implies someone won. This was something far more dangerous: acknowledgement. A child's voice sliced through the noise, a Xarathi hatchling, barely old enough to articulate words, perched on a brood mother's shoulders. What happens now? Elias exhaled, because that was the real question, wasn't it? Ceasefires could be signed in blood. Armadas could stand down, but how do you unlearn 1,000 years of hunger? He reached for the water flask at his hip, only to find a Vossk engineer offering their own. A vessel meant for crystalline tongues, not human lips. The gesture was clumsy, the intention unmistakable. "Now," Elias said, accepting the flask with both hands, "we figure out how to want something besides war." Around him, the crowd shifted, not in agreement, not yet, but in the first tremors of a possibility so terrifying it had kept empires fighting for centuries, the chance to be more than what their past had demanded of them. The Queen's claws flexed, her compound eyes reflecting the faces below, not subjects anymore, but witnesses. and in their gaze something ancient and unyielding finally, irreversibly, began to bend. The alarms shrieked through Nexus 9 Command Center like a living thing in agony, their piercing wail bouncing off screens flickering with emergency glyphs and tactical overlays. Elias gripped the railing, his knuckles blanching as the holographic display zoomed in on the chaos erupting at the station's northern docking ring. A swarm of Xarathi radicals in blackened carapace armor, their pulse rifles carving through bulkheads, while Vossk hardliners advanced from the opposite flank, their crystalline bodies refracting the firelight into jagged, predatory patterns. Two forces that had spent a millennium killing each other, now united by a single purpose, erased the fragile hope blossoming between them. Then the impossible happened. A cluster of Xarathi defectors, their chitins streaked with the vibrant dyes of low-caste nurturers, lunged from a service duct, not toward the Vossk but alongside them. Their claws weren't raised against ancient enemies. They dug into the deck plates, forming a living barricade between the radicals and the command center's access corridor. Across the hall, a squad of Vossk technicians, facets still smudged with engine grease, fanned out in perfect synchronization, their refraction grids humming to life not as weapons but as shields. No orders were given, no treaties signed, just instinct, raw and ungovernable, as two species who'd known nothing but hatred moved as one. Elias's breath caught. On the tactical feed, a Xarathi medic dragged a wounded Vossk engineer behind cover, her mandibles clicking in frantic rhythm as she applied battlefield sutures meant for her own kind. A Vossk artillery officer, his left facet shattered by shrapnel, adjusted his targeting matrix to cover the medic's exposed flank, not because it was strategic. Because it was right. The command center's officers fell silent, their screens reflecting the same impossible tableau. Former enemies fighting shoulder to shoulder, not under coercion but conviction. No grand speeches, no diplomatic accords, just people, broken and bleeding, choosing to stand together against the tide of history. Elias didn't cheer. Didn't rally the troops. He leaned forward, his whisper lost in the din of clashing armies. This is how it should have always been. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the words, the tide turned. A Xarathi radical faltered mid-charge, its aggression pheromones stuttering as it registered the defectors' brood markings. These weren't just traitors. They were siblings, nestmates. Across the line, a Vossk zealot's refraction blades dimmed, its core pulsing with dissonance as it recognized the technician's crest scholars from its own creche spire. The radical's advance didn't collapse in a roar of defiance. It fractured into whispers, into hesitation, into the terrible, beautiful moment when a soldier realizes they've been aiming their rifle at a mirror. Elias exhaled, his reflection floating ghost-like over the holographic carnage. The war wasn't over, but here, in this shattered corridor, something older than empires had finally stirred. Not peace, not yet, but the raw, unyielding truth that every front line is just a story waiting to be rewritten. The deck shuddered beneath Elias's boots as the last of the radical warships breached the station's outer defenses, their plasma batteries painting the observation windows in hellish shades of crimson. Around him, the air reeked of ionized metal and the acrid sweat of species who'd spent lifetimes learning how to kill each other. Xarathi traditionalists clattered their claws in battle rhythms older than human civilization. Vossk zealots hummed the harmonics of their ancestral war chants, the weight of 1,000 years of hatred pressed down like a collapsing star. And Elias. He stepped into the center of it all, no armor, no weapon, just the ragged edges of a voice worn raw from pleading. Look at yourselves. The words weren't a command. They were a scalpel slicing through the tension. You've spent centuries calling each other monsters, and you're right, but not because of your claws or your crystals. Because you'd rather burn the galaxy than admit you were wrong. A Xarathi captain leveled his pulse rifle at Elias's chest, the weapon's charge coils whining to full power. You don't speak for the swarm. The click roar of his voice trembled with something deeper than rage, fear. The fear of a soldier realizing the war he'd built his identity on might have been for nothing. Elias didn't flinch. He spread his arms wide, his shadow stretching across the deck like a surrender flag. Then shoot, but ask yourself, when my body hits the ground, what changes? Another corpse, another rallying cry, another 1,000 years of the same damned story. His gaze flicked to the Vossk sniper crouched in the rafters, her refraction scope trained on his forehead. Or you can lower your weapons just once, just to see what happens. Silence. The kind that thrives in the space between heartbeats, between trigger pulls, between the last breath of an old world and the first gasp of a new one. Then a clatter. The Xarathi captain's rifle hit the deck, his claws shaking not with aggression, but with the weight of an epiphany too heavy to carry. Across the room, the Vossk sniper's scope dimmed, her crystalline fingers uncurling from the weapon stock as if it had burned her. One by one, the sounds of safeties engaging, of blades retracting, of centuries-old grudges crumbling under their own absurdity filled the chamber. Not because of diplomacy, not because of treaties, because Elias had forced them to face the one truth no propaganda could erase, that every war, no matter how ancient, is just a habit waiting to be broken. And in that moment, as the last weapon fell, the galaxy didn't celebrate, it exhaled. The observation deck of Nexus 9 wasn't built for peace. Its viewports still bore the fractal scars of orbital bombardments, their reinforced glass spiderwebbed with cracks that caught the light like frozen lightning. The table at its center, a slab of repurposed hull plating, was littered with data slates and battle maps, their holograms flickering as Xarathi and Vossk delegates leaned in, their claws and crystalline limbs leaving fresh scratches on its surface. Elias watched the tension coil between them, thicker than the station's artificial gravity. Every concession was a battle, every compromise tasted like betrayal. The Vossk elder's harmonics sharpened as it slid a reparations proposal across the table, the numbers glowing like accusations. The swarm incinerated our cultural archives on Vossk 7. These are not negotiable. Across from it, the Xarathi broodmother's pheromones turned acidic. Your blockade starved 4 of our brood clusters. You speak of deaths. We are owed blood. Elias let the silence stretch, not for effect, because he'd learned the hard way that in the wake of war, silence was the only language loud enough to drown out the ghosts. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than the hum of the station's failing life support. The war started with a word. He reached out, tapping the holodisplay between them. The ancient mistranslation shimmered preservation, warped into consumption. A single error etched in fire across the centuries. Let it end with one. He didn't say peace. Peace was a dream for the unburnt. He said, enough. A shudder ran through the brood mother's carapace. The elder's facets dimmed, its core pulsing slower, like a heartbeat counting down to surrender. No grand speeches followed, no ceremonial gestures, just the rasp of chitin on alloy as the Xarathi signed with a claw tip dipped in her own ichor, then passed the slate to the Vossk, who pressed a fractured crystal edge into the surface, leaving a glimmering glyph of consent. Outside the viewports, the stars didn't realign. The dead didn't stir in their graves, but for the first time in recorded history, 2 empires who'd measured their worth in corpses chose to measure it in something far more fragile, the space between one breath and the next. The landing protocols at New Geneva Spaceport had never accounted for this, not for the packed bleachers of politicians in their synth silk banners, not for the armed drones broadcasting live feeds to every corner of the Sol system, certainly not for the way the crowd's roar shook the reinforced glass of the observation decks as Elias stepped from the shuttle ramp. His envoy's coat was still streaked with Vossk coolant fluid and Xarathi ichor, the fabric puckered where a refraction blade had grazed his ribs 3 systems back. The cheering surged louder, a wall of sound built on 1,000 projections. Hero, savior, the man who'd ended the unendable war. Earth's premier was the first to reach him, her augmented palms already extended for the ceremonial grip, her smile calibrated to the perfect mix of gravitas and triumph. "The system owes you more than medals, Ambassador," she began, the subdermal amplifiers in her throat ensuring every syllable carried to the waiting press droves. "Name your—" Elias walked right past her. The silence that followed wasn't stunned, it was ruptured. Politicians froze mid-applause. Propaganda drones wobbled in their hover patterns, their lenses frantically refocusing as he moved through the crowd like a knife through water, his gaze fixed on the spaceport's public transit gates. A junior senator from the Martian colonies lunged into his path, her voice pitching high with desperation. "At least let us announce your victory tour. The people need, peace isn't a spectacle." Elias didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling through the assembled power brokers in widening rings of discomfort. "It's not a treaty to sign or a statue to unveil. It's the choice a Xarathi broodmother makes when she sings her hatchlings to sleep instead of drilling them in pulse rifle maintenance. It's the Vossk artisan who carves memorial shards for the dead of both species. It's carried by everyone who wakes up and decides just for one more day not to pick up the gun." Someone in the crowd shouted about legacy, about history's judgment. Elias turned then just once, his silhouette backlit by the shuttle's still cooling engines. "Then let history judge the work, not the worker." By the time security realized he wasn't headed for the VIP lounges, he'd already melted into a surge of off-shift dockworkers, just another figure in a crowd, his head bowed against the flickering neon of the transit hub's departure board. The drones lost him somewhere between Gate 42 and a dimly lit noodle stall, their algorithms scrambling to explain how a man who'd reshaped the galaxy could vanish into the mundane so completely. But in the weeks that followed, rumors flickered through the underground nets. A Vossk wanderer swore they'd seen a human helping rebuild a shattered crash spire on the edge of contested space. A Xarathi laborer spoke of a soft-voiced stranger who'd shown up unannounced to repair a nutrient vat in the lower brood chambers. No names were given. No recognition sought, just hands that knew the weight of war and the quiet, relentless work of stitching a galaxy back together, one broken thing at a time. The museum's holographic archives hummed softly, their golden light spilling across the polished floor like liquid sunlight. A child heard chitin dappled with crystalline growths, her eyes reflecting both the prismatic shimmer of Vossk heritage and the deep, compound darkness of Xarathi lineage, tilted her head up at the flickering image of Elias. His projection wavered slightly, a ghost from another era, his features worn but kind. "How did one human stop the war?" she asked, her voice the curious, unhurried chime of a generation born after the guns fell silent. The hologram didn't recite treaties or battle statistics. It didn't speak of leverage or diplomacy. It smiled, a small, tired thing, by reminding them they were always capable of peace. Behind the child, her parents, a Xarathi broodmother with scarred forelimbs and a Vossk artisan missing half his facets, exchanged a glance. Their claws and crystalline fingers intertwined, an unspoken truth passing between them. The child frowned, but everyone says peace is hard. The hologram's laugh was a static, riddled whisper. "It is, but war is harder. We just forget because it's familiar." The projection flickered, gesturing to the museum around them. The salvaged pulse rifles displayed like ancient relics, the shattered command shards suspended in stasis fields. "Your parents could have been killing each other right now. Instead, they made you." A pause. The child's antennae twitched as she absorbed this, her gaze drifting to her parents' joined hands. The Xarathi's claws, once honed for combat, now cradled the Vosk's fractured fingers with a gentleness that would have been unthinkable decades before. The hologram watched her, its expression softening. "That's all I did," showed them the choice they'd stopped seeing. Outside the museum's arched windows, the skyline of New Unity Spire stretched into the horizon, its towers a fusion of chitin and crystalline latticework. The war wasn't erased, its scars still ached, But here, in this quiet corner of the future, a child born of two former enemies turned a question over in her mind, not how, but why it had taken so long. And maybe the hologram mused as its projection began to fade. That was the real lesson. Not that peace was possible, but that it had been there all along, waiting in the space between breaths, between heartbeats, between the last shot fired and the first hand hesitantly offered. The rumors started as most do, whispers in dockworker taverns, coded transmissions between relief workers, the kind of stories that thrive in the cracks between official histories. A human matching Elias's description had been spotted on Varaxis 3, a backwater world straddling the old neutral zone. They said he lived in a prefab hut near the salt flats, that he traded stories for supplies with passing caravans, that sometimes at dusk you could hear him singing an old Earth folk song to the wind. When the envoys arrived, a Xarathi brood scout and a Vossk archivist traveling together for the first time without armed escorts, they found the hut empty. Not abandoned, lived in, a pot of bitterroot tea steamed on the heating coil, a child's drawing, crude but unmistakable, a stick figure, human holding hands with a Xarathi and a Vossk, was pinned to the wall with a shard of shrapnel. And on the table, weighted down by a fractured piece of starship hull, a single sheet of recycled pulp paper. The war wasn't ended by me. The handwriting was uneven, the letters smudged as if written in haste or emotion. It was ended by all who listened. The archivist's crystalline facets dimmed, refracting the words into prismatic fragments across the walls. The brood scout's claws trembled against the paper, her pheromones spiking with something neither species had a name for, not grief, not awe, but the vertigo of a paradigm shifting underfoot. Because they'd come seeking a hero, what they found was a mirror. Outside, the wind howled across the salt flats, scouring away footprints. Somewhere to the east, a caravan's harmonic chimes echoed Xarathi trade rhythms blending with Vossk traveling hymns, a sound that would have been unthinkable 5 years prior. The envoys stood there a long time, the note between them, realizing the most terrifying truth of all. Elias hadn't given them peace, he'd given them responsibility. Not the neat, cinematic kind wrapped in treaties and victory speeches, but the messy, daily work of choosing over and over, not to pick up the weapons they'd been born holding. And in that moment they understood why he'd vanished, because legends are comfortable. They let you point at statues and say, they fixed it, but a man who walks away. He forces you to ask the only question that ever really matters. What now? The crater at Vesh Rock still smoldered. Not from plasma burns or orbital strikes, those scars had faded centuries ago, but from the sheer weight of memory. This was where it began, where 1,000 years of bloodshed had ignited over a mistranslated word. Now the earth trembled under a different kind of force, the synchronized footfalls of Xarathi architects and Vossk artisans as they descended into the basin, their tools inscribing not war chants but a single syllable into the living rock. The monument rose slowly, a fusion of chitin and crystal, its surface etched with the jagged glyphs of the Xarathi war scribes alongside the precise harmonic grooves of Vossk stone singers. At its base, the word enough pulsed in both languages, not carved but grown, as if the very land had sighed it into being. The Xarathi glyphs were angular, urgent, the strokes clawed deep as if trying to tear free from history. The Vossk harmonics swirled around them, softening the edges, turning defiance into something almost like lullaby. Together, they didn't just share meaning. They shared cadence, the rhythm of a heartbeat finally slowing after centuries of fevered rage. The unveiling ceremony had no speeches, no grand delegations. Just a single Xarathi brood mother, her carapace streaked with the faded paint of 100 battles, kneeling to press her forehead against the stone. Then a Vossk elder, its facets cracked from old artillery fire, laying a single shard of its own body at the monument's base. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was ruptured, the sound of a galaxy relearning how to breathe. Pilgrims came, not just from the former empires, but from species who'd never known the war, drawn by the legend of the thing itself. A Xarathi trader left her plasma cutter in the dust, its grip still warm from use. A Grothly miner stacked his seismic charges neatly beside it, the detonators disarmed. Weapons piled up like offerings at an altar, not surrendered but released, as if the monument were less a symbol and more a living thing, hungry for the weight of all that unused violence. And sometimes, when the twin moons of Vesh rock aligned just right, the monument sang. A low, resonant hum that wasn't quite Xarathi, wasn't quite Vossk, but something born of both. The pilgrims would fall silent then, their claws and tendrils and grasping limbs going still, because in that sound they didn't hear triumph, they didn't hear an ending. They heard the first note of a question still being answered, century by century, by every hand that chose not to reach for a weapon. The war had been built on a lie. The peace was built on something far more fragile, a word whispered into the dark, and the terrible, beautiful courage it takes to mean it. The legend of Elias Vance doesn't end with parades or statues. It lingers in the quiet moments, the way a Xarathi teacher pauses before recounting the war to her hatchlings, the hesitation in a Vossk scholar's harmonics when describing their own ancestors' atrocities. What makes this story endure isn't the spectacle of peace, but the uncomfortable intimacy of its birth, the way it forces every listener to confront the fractures in their own certainties. Consider the last time you changed someone's mind, not with facts, not with force, but by dismantling the story they'd built around themselves. That's what Elias understood. Wars don't persist because people love violence, they persist because violence becomes identity. The Xarathi weren't just fighting the Vossk, they were fighting the version of themselves that would cease to exist if they stopped. The real battlefield wasn't in space, it was in the mirror. The archives call him a diplomat, but that's too clean. Diplomats negotiate within systems. Elias did something far more dangerous. He exposed the system as a choice. When he stood before the High Queen with nothing but a mistranslated word and the corpses it had created, he wasn't offering an alternative. He was holding up a reflection so stark, so unbearable, that the only options were annihilation, of self or of war. That's why the myth endures not as a hero's journey, but as a question etched into the walls of every rebuilt city. What are you willing to lose to be free of your own stories? Because the terrifying truth beneath this legend is that Elias didn't defeat anything. He simply spoke words so undeniable, so corrosive to the fictions upholding that 1,000-year massacre, that the empires had to choose between waking up or doubling down on the nightmare. We retell these moments, the assassin's blade freezing mid-swing, the queen's claws retracting, the hatchling lowering her rifle, not as history but as possibility. The next time someone tells you, that's just how things are, remember, the most revolutionary act isn't violence, it's looking at the machinery of the world and whispering, prove it. So when you hear this story again, don't marvel at Elias. Marvel at the brokers who turned arms, deals into supply routes, at the poets who taught war chants to sound like lullabies, at every ordinary being who woke up and chose to believe their enemies might grieve too. That's the real secret this legend leaves us, not that one man changed everything, but that he gave permission for everyone else to realize they always could. The war ended with a word. The peace begins with a choice, yours, mine, the next voice trembling in the dark. That's how legends outlive their heroes, when they stop being stories we hear and start being invitations we answer.